This week, the Kenyatta International Convention Centre in Nairobi is hosting what is being called the Africa Forward Summit. 30 heads of state, 4,000 delegates used to do performing at Kasarani. Billboards up all over the city. On the surface, a triumph of Kenyan diplomacy. But here is what the billboards don't say. France didn't choose Kenya because Kenya is powerful. France chose Kenya because France got kicked out of everywhere else. Welcome to the Kenyan News Tours. I'm your host, DY. Let's start with why we're here. Definitely not the summit. The desperation that made the summit necessary. For over 6 decades, France maintained what can only be described as the world's most elaborate protection racket on the African continent. They had the audacity to name Françafrique. And this is how it worked. France's former colonies got formal independence. Flags, anthems, the whole ceremony. But the actual machinery of power, that stayed French. France kept troops stationed in at least 8 African countries simultaneously. Between 1964 and 2014 alone, France conducted no fewer than 52, and I mean 52 military interventions across Africa. Not 5, not 10, 52, as in 52. Some of those countries voted for the same president for over 40 years. Coincidence, surely? Then there's the money. The CFA franc, originally standing for Franc des Colonies Françaises d'Afrique, which literally translates to franc of the French colonies of Africa, was imposed on what became 14 nations. And here's the part that should make every Pan-Africanist lose sleep. Countries in the CFA zone were required to deposit a substantial portion of their foreign exchange reserves directly into the French treasury. Just think about that. Your country earns foreign currency. You send it to Paris for safekeeping. In exchange, your monetary policy is controlled by France. Your ability to respond to your own economic crisis? Absolutely limited. One Harvard researcher described it as a monetary system that will always ultimately fail to eradicate neo-colonialism. As long as former colonial power sits at the center, they call it inherently unequal and rooted in exploitative practices. Is the system that was supposed to end with independence. Sadly, it didn't. And for most of those 60 years, the African heads of state who benefited from the French backing stayed very, very quiet about it. Then something changed. The African people, not the presidents, not the ambassadors, not even the diplomats clutching their podiums, the actual people lost patience. Mali 2021, the military removes a France-backed government. France condemns it. The Malian people celebrate in the streets. Burkina Faso 2022, another coup, another France-backed president gone. French special forces, around 400 of them given their marching orders in January 2023. Niger 2023, coup number 3 in the Sahel. France's last counter-terror ally in the region turns. France actually attempts to organize a military intervention through ECOWAS. It doesn't happen. And by December 2023, the last French troops leave Niger. France is so furious. They announce plans to close their embassy in Niamey entirely. Then there's Chad, November 2024. President Mahamat Deby, whose military coup to succeed his dead dictator father was backed by France, terminates defense cooperation agreement, says it's obsolete and lacks real added value. When even your puppets start reading the room, things are changing. Senegal, Ivory Coast, French bases handed over. Senegal's President Faye announces all foreign military bases will close by 2025. In 5 years, France went from 10,000 soldiers across Africa to roughly 2,000, mostly clustered in Djibouti. That is not a strategic pivot. That, my friends, that is a rout. The alliance of Sahel states, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, didn't just kick out French troops. They withdrew entirely from ECOWAS. They withdrew from the International Organization of La Francophonie, calling it a remote control political instrument operated from France. They started building their own confederation, their own currency plans, their own security pacts. And Macron went on television and said, France never disagrees with the people of Africa, only with their governments. The same governments France spent 60 odd years installing and protecting. Sure, Emmanuel, sure. So, France is losing Africa fast. And rather than sit in Paris and accept the humiliation, Emmanuel Macron calls up William Ruto and says, hey, what if we held a summit, in your country about African partnerships and innovation? And Ruto says, and I cannot stress this enough, hell yeah. We'll come back to that. But first, who exactly is William Ruto going into this summit? And why would he want to co-host the image rehabilitation tour of the continent's most recently evicted colonial power? Let's talk about William Samoei Ruto's domestic reality right now, because context is everything. A survey from late 2024 found that 83.5% of Kenyans disapproved of Ruto's presidency. Not were uncertain, not were undecided, completely disapproved. For reference, Mwai Kibaki's disapproval rating at his worst was about 1.8%. Even Uhuru Kenyatta, who managed to accumulate a national debt so catastrophic it became its own genre of comedy, sat at 44.9% disapproval. Ruto was at 83.5%. By late 2025, InfoTrack had him, leading 2027 presidential polling at 28%. So he's the front runner with 28%. As you should listen to that again. He's a front runner. He is the actual front runner, but with a measly 28%. I guess we don't know the math. That is not a commanding incumbency. That is a man winning a race because everyone else tripped. The backstory you need: in June 2024, youth-led protesters who had been watching a finance bill that would have, crushed low-income Kenyans sail through a rubber-stamped parliament, physically stormed the National Assembly. Some sections caught fire. Ruto's government deployed lava ammunition. Multiple protesters lost their lives. The world watched Kenyan security forces shoot at their own children on live stream. Then Ruto eventually withdrew the finance bill, dissolved his cabinet, brought Raila Odinga's people into government in what he called a broad-based arrangement that his critics called co-option of dissent. And his supporters called it national unity. The late Raila himself, the perennial opposition giant, died into October 2025. The political landscape Ruto is navigating in 2026 is, to put it diplomatically, unstable. Because you see, a TIFA research survey found 75% of Kenyans believed the country was on the wrong track. Ruto's own assessment delivered to a parliamentary group: if I hadn't implemented the new funding model, SHA, housing, I would be a very popular person. But the country would not have moved anywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, I do not know whether we are moving or we are retrogressing. But hey, whether forward or backwards, I guess that is still motion. It's a version of that statement that is, courageous. There's also a version where it's a man rationalizing why 83% of his countrymen think he's failing, not one, not two, but failing all of them. And both sadly can be true. Internationally, Ruto has actually tried to play a fascinating card. He has styled Kenya as, as a neither east nor west, but forward kind of player, an independent African voice. He led Kenya's deployment of police to Haiti, which we didn't really like, but he was the only African country willing to put boots on the ground for the UN mission. He has been vocal on global financial architecture reform, pushing for African debt restructuring and fairer international finance, which I actually agree with him. He took a state visit to Beijing in April 2025 and praised China's New World Order, which then got the US Senate reviewing Kenya's major non-NATO ally status. So when he says Kenya is looking neither east nor west, America took that personally. His foreign policy in 2025 had genuine ambition. It also had serious stumbles. Kenya's bid to lead the African Union Commission chair, a campaign Nairobi invested significant political capital in, failed in Addis Ababa, and the Tumaini Peace Initiative for South Sudan collapsed. The DRC refused to accredit to successive Kenyan ambassadors, accusing Ruto of siding with Rwanda. And then in September 2025, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York, Ruto agreed to co-host the Africa Forward Summit with Emmanuel Macron. France's ambassador to Kenya would later say Paris had taken responsibility for past mistakes. Yeah, taken responsibility, France, for past mistakes in Africa. But there are no reparation discussions, no mentions of the CFA franc, no accounting for 52 military interventions, no tribunal for the Rwandan genocide in which French complicity has been extensively documented. Just a summit in Nairobi with 4,000 delegates and Yusundu. I want to be fair here, because I know some of you are watching this and thinking, isn't this better than nothing? Isn't a rebranded France better than the old France? And that is a legitimate question, and I promise we're going to answer it. But first, let me show you exactly what the rebranding actually looks like and what is going to cost. The official summit website describes this gathering as aiming for a paradigm shift to a more balanced, equitable, and mutually respectful partnership. The theme is Africa-France partnerships for innovation and growth. The stated agenda covers reform of the international financial architecture, energy transition, green industrialization, the blue economy, AI, sustainable agriculture, and health. Admirable topics, all of them. The kind of topics that look excellent on a brochure and require years and follow-up or follow-through to mean absolutely anything. The French Foreign Ministry has framed the summit as the culmination of a process Macron began with his 2017 speech in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, where he promised a new generation-to-generation relationship with Africa. That was 9 years ago. In the 9 years, you ask? France has been expelled from 6 African countries. The summit is notably the first of its kind held in an Anglophone African country. The French Foreign Ministry calls this a notable shift and proof of an open and future-focused relationship. Translation: we can't hold this in Francophone Africa anymore because they are all not speaking to us. So, Kenya and France signed 11 bilateral agreements on the eve of the summit, covering a nuclear energy plant, transport modernization, and sustainable agriculture. France is described as Kenya's 5th largest foreign direct investor, supporting roughly 46,000 jobs. Trade between these two countries sits around $300 million annually. These are real numbers, meaningful even. We can't even question or argue with them. But the question is not whether the economics are real. The question is whether the framing, partnership of equals, African agency, mutual respect holds up when you examine who needed this summit more. Let's talk about what taking responsibility would actually require. France's role in the 1994 Rwandan genocide is documented, uncontested, but serious. French forces were present before and during the genocide. Operation Turquoise, the French intervention, has been accused by the Rwandan authorities of protecting genocidaires as much as the victims. President Macron acknowledged French responsibility in 2021. No reparations, no tribunal. France supported dictators across the continent for decades, explicitly, because those dictators protected French economic and strategic interests. Idriss Déby of Chad, whose death in 2021 was quickly followed by France backing his son's military coup to inherit power, is one of the cleaner examples. That's not ancient history. Guys, that's just like 5 odd years ago. The CFA franc has not been abolished. The 14 countries still in the franc zone still have their monetary sovereignty constrained by the architecture designed in Paris. Macron and Ivory Coast's Ouattara announced a reform in 2019, renaming it the ECO or the ECO. The French Treasury's structural role was supposed to be reduced. Critics, including Senegalese economist Ndongo Samba Saila, noted that as long as the peg to the euro and the French guarantees remained, then the fundamental dependency would still persist. As one analyst put it, a monetary system that holds a former colonial power as the guarantor will always ultimately fail to eradicate neo-colonialism. France conducted 52 military interventions in Africa between 1964 and 2014. Not in self-defense, in service of political outcomes that suited Paris. When those interventions became unattainable, when the populations being protected started banning French flags, Paris described it as a misunderstanding, as the people being deceived by the anti-French sentiment, as if rage against 60 years of extraction is just, and I don't know how to even say it, that it's just a PR problem. The Alliance of Sahel States has a word for this. When France began announcing base closures, the AES released a statement warning that France was simply replacing visible mechanisms with less visible mechanisms that pursue the same neo-colonial ambition. They were watching France try to rebrand in real time, and they named it. Which brings us back to the question, what is this summit? Really? Is it Africa being heard, or is it France finding a new venue? Anglophone this time, with a compliant host, from which the claim has changed. I want to be careful here about something. Criticizing Ruto for hosting the summit is not the same as saying that he should have refused all engagements with France. Multilateral diplomacy is not binary. It's not, ones or zeros. Kenya has a genuine economic interest in this relationship. France is a real investor. Kenyan private sector has real stakes in these conversations. But, and I beg that you listen to me, Ruto has built this international brand around African agency, financial sovereignty, and reform of global institutions that disadvantage Africa. He has spoken at Davos, at the UN, at climate summits, about the need for a more equitable global financial architecture. He has been eloquent and correct about all of this. And then he agreed, in September 2025, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, to give Macron's Africa Reset Tour a prestigious KICC-sized platform. The first Anglophone to co-host, the Silicon Savannah as the backdrop runs image rehabilitation tour. His own opposition, one of his own opposition leaders, Kalonzo Musyoka, said there will be an air of pretense that we are a cohesive nation. We know that is far from the truth. This is from a man whose criticism of Ruto have often been politically motivated. But on this point, the observation about optics is actually not wrong. There is a version of this summit where Kenya extracts maximum benefit. And I don't want to come out like, like a hater for no good reason. That I'm doing this, just because I do not support or do not, agree with Ruto's political dreams or ambitions. I have to accept that, there is a version of this that Kenya extracts maximum benefit. Technology transfers, investment, support for debt restructuring reform at the multilateral level, and a seat, and perhaps a seat at the table of post-Françafrique African diplomacy. If Ruto has a strategy beyond the photo op, it lives in the details of those 11 bilateral agreements and in whether this summit actually produces, relevant and tangible follow-through. But there's another version. The version being watched very closely from Bamako, from Ouagadougou, from Niamey, where an Anglophone African president provides the legitimacy that the Francophone leaders can no longer afford to provide. Where Nairobi becomes the new staging ground for an influence France cannot stage in its own backyard anymore. The most important question is whether Ruto knows the difference and whether it matters to him going into, 2027. Here's the thing that, doesn't get said enough about this summit. Both these men needed it. Macron is a leader whose African policy is in ruins. His domestic popularity is limited. His foreign policy legacy on Africa is generously contested. He needs images. He needs headlines that say new era. He needs an Anglophone partner willing to stand next to him in front of 30 African heads of state and say, we are starting over again. Ruto, on the other hand, is a leader with 83% domestic disapproval. A 2027 election coming, a botched finance bill that triggered the largest youth uprising Kenya has seen in a generation, a foreign policy setbacks in the DRC and South Sudan, and a desperate need to project gravitas, relevance, and results. So, a summit of 4,000 delegates and 30 heads of state at KICC, co-chaired by a G7 leader. That's not diplomacy for its own sake. That's a campaign rally. A very expensive, internationally broadcast campaign rally. And the tragedy, the part that should frustrate every Pan-Africanist watching, is that the legitimate agenda buried inside this summit is actually real and important. Debt restructuring, green industrialization, AI and digital infrastructure, financial architecture reforms. These are the right conversations. Africa should be having them at scale, but on its own terms. The problem is that wrapping those conversations in a France-Africa summit, with the French president as a co-chair, the French flag flying at State House, French investors in the room with checkbooks, doesn't put Africa center. It puts the relationship with France at the center, which is exactly where France wants for all of this to be. So what would, a genuine African agency look like here? What would it look like for this summit to produce something other than mutual PR? We are going to answer that, and then we are going to give you the verdict. This show is called, The Kenyan Week That Was, and our tagline goes by receipts of our vibes always. So let's apply that very test. If this summit is genuinely, about a new France-Africa relationship, not a rebranding exercise, not a PR reset, here's what the receipts would look like. Number one, a concrete time-bound commitment to CFA franc reform. Not the name change, not a name change, not a joint commission to explore options, an actual transition roadmap that reduces and eventually eliminates French treasury control over the monetary sovereignty of 14 African states. Number two, A France-supported push at the G7 and G20 for meaningful African debt restructuring. Not the cosmetic common framework that has stalled for years, but actual suspension and renegotiation mechanisms that give African governments fiscal room to invest in their own people. 3, a reparations framework discussion. Not a settlement, not necessarily even an agreement, but an acknowledgement that the economic extraction of the Françafrique is a documented historical reality that requires more than a speech and a summit to address. 4, technology and IP transfer agreements in those 11 bilateral deals that actually build Kenyan and African capacity, not just French firms operating in Kenya with Kenyan labor. And then 5, a monitoring mechanism, not another communiqué. Actual benchmark, timelines, and public accountability for delivery. If the African Forward Summit produces any 3 of those 5, then perhaps it is meaningful. If it produces a joint statement, a concert at Kasarani, and photos of 30 presidents smiling, it is what it looks like. 2 men who needed each other, covering each other's behinds. Here's the uncomfortable Pan-African truth that this summit sits on top of. The countries that kicked France out are not, by any objective measure, suddenly free. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger are all under military governments. They are dealing with ongoing jihadist insurgency. Wagner Group mercenaries have replaced French troops. Whether that trade is genuinely better for Malian and Burkinabe civilians is a legitimate, urgent, and under-resolved question. Pan-Africanism is not the same as anti-Westernism. Exchanging French extraction for Russian extraction is not sovereignty. The AES countries are right to assert that France's departure was necessary. The harder work, building institution, democratic accountability, economic diversification is what comes next. And military governments are historically who are bad. What those countries did demonstrate is something powerful. That the African people, when they decide enough is enough, can force change. That the coups were messy and anti-democratic in method, but the sentiment underneath all of them, a generation's fury at a system that took and called it partnership. That sentiment, my friends, is legitimate, and it is the reason Emmanuel Macron is in Nairobi today instead of being told to stay home. The question Kenya has to answer, the question Ruto himself has to answer, is whether sitting at this table accelerates the structural change that Africans actually need, or whether it just provides France with the legitimacy to keep operating on the continent while calling it something absolutely new. Here's where we land. France needed this summit more than Africa did. Full stop. A country that went from 10,000 troops to 2,000 in 5 years, that was expelled from 6 nations in a row, that watched its strategic Dam of Africa identity evaporate. That country does not host a partnership of equals out of generosity. It hosts it because the alternative is irrelevance. Macron's line that France never disagrees with the people of Africa, only their governments, is historically illiterate. France disagreed with the people of Africa for 60 years. It installed, propped up, and protected governments that the people didn't choose, precisely because those governments cooperated with France. The people burning French flags in Bamako are not confused about history. They had all the receipts. Ruto is a more complicated case. He is a leader in real trouble domestically, with real ambitions internationally. Hosting this summit is, in the most charitable reading, a strategic choice to extract value from France's desperation, to position Kenya as the indispensable Anglophone interlocutor for the chastened former colonial power, while leveraging those 11 bilateral agreements, and the platform for financial architecture reform that France has agreed to support. In the less charitable reading, He gave away Kenya's image and, by extension, a degree of Pan-African moral authority to a man who needed a venue and a co-chair without extracting anything structurally transformative in return. And he did it 12 months before a presidential election, which suggests the 4,000 delegates and the Yusundo concert are as much about domestic optics as they are continental strategy. The African Forward Summit could be the beginning of something real, a genuine reset where France, having been humbled, actually shows up differently, with resources, without conditions, without the shadow of Françafrique. Or it could be what it looks like right now. Two leaders with failing approval ratings and wounded continental standing, giving each other exactly what each needs. France gets legitimacy and Ruto gets a stage. And our 1.4 billion and 1.4 billion Africans get a concert at Kasarani and a communiqué. We'll be watching the receipts because vibes, as always, are never our point. This has been your host, DY. That is a Kenyan week that was. And if this episode gave you something to think about, share it. If it made you angry, good. That's what accountability journalism is supposed to do. Next week, we're going to follow the money. What is actually in those 11 bilateral agreements that Kenya signed with France, and who specifically in Kenya stands to benefit, because the summit may be over, but the deals are just beginning. Again, I'm your host, DY. This has been the Kenyan week that was. Like we always leave you, receipts of our vibes always. See you next week.